Hello everyone, my name is Dr. Paul Rose, and in this presentation I'd like to talk about the one plan approach to conservation, how we can attempt to predict the future when it comes to looking at key points for conservation action, and how we can integrate long-term planning for successful conservation action using information from the wild and from the captive world to best understand how a species is likely to persist and be viable into the future. And I'm going to talk about the one plan approach using my plastic friends here. So hopefully this will give you an idea of why one plan is so essential to modern day conservation action, and particularly why it can bring together the wild world and the captive world and all of the expertise that's contained within the two.
Difference in scale of management is the basic premise of the one plan approach, and I've attempted to summarize one plan in this diagram here. One plan is administered by the Conservation Planning Specialist Group of the Species Survival Commission of the IUCN. One plan brings together conservation experts, wildlife managers, field and zoo biologists, population managers, landowners, government agencies, anything that is relevant to how the species is managed in the wild and in the zoo, as well as local people and stakeholders within the animal's range states that have expert knowledge on the movements, population structures and dynamics of these species, as well as information on how the species might interact with the local inhabitants of the area. All of this expertise then fits into an integrated species conservation strategy. And this is a sliding scale, as I just said, between conservation action for the wild and the captive population and how it's managed to meet a particular conservation role. And this can be weighted more to one side compared to the other, depending on the species needs. More weight towards the wild population's conservation action, or more weight towards the management and sustainability of the zoo-based population. But ultimately, all of this information, all of this expertise from those in the field, from those that are species experts, from those that are biologists, and those that live alongside of the animal, provide the support for a common goal, which is a viable population of the species that thrives within a healthy ecosystem. Ecosystems don't work without all of the species' interactions with them. So by ensuring conservation action at the species level, which can ultimately reinforce the viability and sustainability of that species within its habitat, the wider health and the wider relevance of the habitat to the human and the non-human animal is realized. Integrated species conservation strategy does not work on its own. Nobody can work in a vacuum. Consequently, one of the main things about the one plan approach, one of its key aims, is to bring together the zoo and the wild, the expertise within both, because ultimately there is knowledge that is shared between these two different camps of people with benefit to the animal regardless of where it's found, be it the zoo-housed individual or the wild individual.
So why am I talking to you with a herd of plastic giraffe in front of me? Well, the giraffe is a really nice example of how the one plan approach could be integrated across the zoo world and the wild world. And working with my colleagues in the IUCN Giraffe and Okapi Specialist Group, a few years ago we attempted to explain the relevance of the captive giraffe population and the way in which we can direct questions using giraffes in captivity to enable research out in the field. So using the captive giraffe to answer questions that relate to conservation issues for the wild giraffe. But more generally, because the giraffe is housed in so many facilities around the world, it provides the researcher with an excellent sample population that can be used to investigate key questions that ultimately will have impact across a wide range of individuals and a wide range of settings. What I would also like to do with my plastic friends is use them to explain the premise of the one plan approach, the idea of this sliding scale of management between different populations of individuals, and how both the zoo and the wild can benefit from one plan. Giraffe taxonomy is currently contended and slightly confusing. Let's just say that at the moment the IUCN recognises one species with 9 subspecies, and those 9 subspecies in the wild do not interbreed. So we need to be conserving the genetic potential of each of those particular subspecies because they clearly have key adaptive benefits for remaining as single interbreeding populations. They don't breed with other subspecies. So zoos need to consider how they population manage their giraffe to ensure that the animals they are attempting to conserve are individuals of those subspecies that obviously have this important adaptive potential within them. Remember, conservation is all about conserving the actual usefulness of the species into the future, i.e. all of the genetic information it contains that allows it to change and be more adaptive to prevailing environmental changes. We're not so much conserving the individual, we're conserving all of the genetic goodness within the individuals within the population. So what I'm going to do now is sort of explain, I hope, how one plan works using my plastic friends here. This is our overall population of giraffe, and let's imagine that they are split between different areas of the world. Let's imagine that we have got different populations that are doing slightly different things. So we can segregate our giraffe out into areas of the world where they're found, and they might be in a different scale of management on the one side compared to the other side.
Some of you might be thinking that one plan is just simply a new badge for conservation work that has already been going on, bringing animals into captivity, breeding them and releasing them. And to some extent, there's a grain of truth in that. But it's this integration of collection planning, species expertise and knowledge, and real tangible links to the field that makes one plan so useful. Particularly because it can strategize, lead to policy change, and lead to the development of a fluidity in zoo collection planning that is really relevant to those out in the field, those animals out in the field. But we must remember that there are many successful conservation initiatives that have gone on in the past that we can also use to develop our understanding of how conservation can work in the future. And perhaps one of the most famous of that is the California condor. And I was lucky enough to go and visit the reintroduction, release and captive breeding site of the California condor at the San Diego Zoo Wild Animal Park back in 2014 to see just how these birds are actually managed for reintroduction into the wild. Without an understanding of the animal's life history strategy and without an understanding of its ecology, conservation simply wouldn't be successful. Without all of the knowledge encapsulated in those zookeepers to look after this bird, those doing the reintroductions, those working out into the field, wouldn't understand the nature of the animal, how they'd been managed, and how they'd been prepared for release. So regardless of what we call conservation, in situ and ex situ, or one plan, it is about more collaboration. It is about appreciating the work of the zoo scientist and the zookeeper, as well as the field biologist and conservation scientist. Remember, as I've already said, we don't work in a vacuum. If we are to conserve biodiversity, there needs to be much greater knowledge exchange to ensure we've got more successful projects like the California condor. These should not be the few and far between. This type of approach should become the norm.
So let's go back to my herd of plastic giraffe. How can we apply a one plan approach to these particular animals? Let's imagine that these animals here all live in the zoo. They are looked after by our expert zookeeper with his blue bucket. And let's imagine that these animals on this side are all out in the wild, and they're looked after by this field biologist with her binoculars and terrifying hair. How can we get these animals to be relevant to the ones out in the wild? And how do we get these animals to be relevant to the ones in the zoo? It's all about the sharing of information, the knowledge gain that comes from the management of the species, wherever it's found, and the collaboration that exists between the experts that are those involved with the populations either in the wild or in captivity. These captive giraffe can have usefulness to scientific research and the trialling of conservation methods that might be relevant to these animals out in the wild. And likewise, the information that we know about the wild giraffe can then be applied directly to improve captive management. The likelihood of these animals going back into the field is slim to none, but we can still manage our populations in captivity so that they are viable and therefore they potentially have a use into the future for any young that are produced. So when all of the expert work of our zookeeper has paid dividends, and we have youngsters born into this captive herd, which are continuing the pedigree of these animals, ensuring that all of those adaptive traits are being maintained, it is these animals that are likely to be the future of that population should these ones in the wild ever completely die out.
As an example of how information can be fluid between the wild and the field, this is an example of a diagram that a co-author and myself have written for a paper that is currently under review. It shows the relevance of social networks analysis to a range of populations, be those out in the field and those in the zoo. And again, the giraffe is used as the example. Social networks analysis has a real conservation relevance. It enables the fine-scale social structure of a species to be evaluated in detail, and therefore we can use information on the individual's role within its social group, its interactions with others, and its influence over others when we come to determine our decision-making for population management. And again, that can be population management in the field and in the zoo. Giraffe, for example, are translocated between areas of their range states in the wild, and giraffe are also moved between zoos. We know how to move, when to move, and who to move based on the findings of social research. So we can assess the network structure in the wild against our captive groups. We can observe patterns and trends of free-living social groups, and therefore we can use that information on wild ecology to improve productivity and sustainability of our zoo-housed giraffe. We know the giraffe has a fission-fusion social structure. We know that males move around and females are relatively stable in their social bonds. We know there is a strong mother-calf relationship, and we know that giraffe can group by kin. So all of these key facets of wild ecology can be inputted into the social network analysis done in the zoo to see who likes to be with who is a bit more of a social butterfly, and then who makes the best candidates for movement and translocation between facilities. Likewise, from going from the zoo into the wild, observations of how individuals change and how social change also impacts those individuals allows for further analysis of the social structure. The impact of social change on a network structure and function tells us a lot about individual animal welfare states. How do some individuals cope better than others with social upheaval? And consequently, we can then use that information for management strategies in the wild to reduce any negative impacts on social networks. How many individuals do we translocate? At what age do we translocate them? And who do we take together? All of these things are really, really important when it comes to supporting the future viability of any translocated populations. Going back to my example of the California condor, we know that in some species they must be reintroduced in social groups because that facilitates the long-term augmentation of that population and the likelihood that that population will survive into the future.
Without all of that information from the wild informing captive care, and without the trialling of methods directly applicable to the wild being used on captive animals, an integrated conservation approach simply wouldn't work. What one plan is designed to do is look at this sliding scale of management across an entire species. It removes the barriers of in situ and ex situ conservation. We don't simply talk about conservation in the zoo. We don't simply talk about conservation in captivity. Our meta-population approach means that all animals are involved, all animals are valuable, and all animals are equally as useful to that conservation project. When we have babies born in the wild, we know that they are continuing on the genetic line of that species. We know that they are going to be the ones that natural selection has designed, because of all of the adaptive potential of their parents, to continue that line into the future. But these animals here are also going to carry the same traits within them as the wild animals do. So they are still useful to be conserved and managed in exactly the same way as we do in the wild. It's about the genetic potential of individuals in conservation programs. So we remove the labels that conservation is done in this way in the zoo, or conservation is done in this way in the wild. Conservation is done holistically for that whole species. It's the sliding scale of how much effort is put in for the conservation efforts in the zoo and the conservation efforts in the wild. So ultimately, a one-plan approach to giraffe conservation sees the captive individuals being beneficial to the wild and the wild individuals being beneficial to those in the zoo. And therefore, the role of my keeper with his blue bucket and my ranger with her terrifying hair is a collaborative one that brings that information together, where people learn from their approaches of the animals that they work with and share that information with others to further integrate conservation action that will ultimately be successful for that particular population within that particular area.
If you'd like to know more about how the one plan approach is relevant to giraffe, then this article, co-written by myself and the chair of the IUCN Giraffe and Okapi Group, Dr. Julian Fennessy, can be found in the summer 2014 edition of the EARSA magazine, Zooquaria. If you can't get hold of it and you'd like to read it, drop me a line. The key thread of this article is an argument that the zoo population of giraffe around the world is relatively substantial and therefore has real conservation relevance. We're not suggesting putting zoo giraffe back into the wild, although with the refined population management techniques in captivity, one day that may be a possibility. We're talking about the value that can be added to the conservation by using the zoo giraffe to promote the conservation action so urgently needed for the wild giraffe. The wild giraffe conservation plight is considered a silent extinction. This is a very familiar animal, but it's sliding towards a precipice with a population crash across much of its range. Therefore, zoos can do real, tangible conservation action, raising awareness, encouraging people to understand why the giraffe is important to its ecosystem, and providing more information on key facets of animal biology that are hard to study in the wild. We suggest that more research crossover is needed between the zoo and the field to enable zoo scientists to answer these directed questions using their captive populations of giraffe that will really meet the needs of conservation scientists working out in the field. Increasing collaboration and increasing knowledge exchange is a really important aspect of One Plan. And as I've already said, it's this sliding scale of management. We know a lot about how to keep giraffe in zoos. Yes, we're not perfect at it, but we know enough to build on the good elements of practice to ensure that we can keep up with our work on maintaining sustainable and viable captive populations. Therefore, by using these animals for research and by using them to promote conservation, we ultimately forge more links between the zoo and between the wild world, which will not only benefit the giraffe, but it will also benefit the wider ecosystem to which they belong. So how does the One Plan approach help a zoo and other conservation institutions look to the future? Zoos have limited space, finances, personnel and resources to devote to the animals within their collection, and to devote to external conservation work too. Certainly in the UK and Ireland, zoos have 4 aims that they need to fulfil. and therefore that will be a big drive for the types of animals they keep in the collection. Zoos are also obligated to work with external institutions to meet their objectives, and again that will influence the species kept and where the money goes for external projects. The one-plan approach enables a rationalization and consideration of these different points. It allows zoos to prioritize the types of animals they house. It allows them to get a cost-benefit analysis for the amount of effort and the usefulness of that effort that will come from conservation initiatives, as well as evaluate any links to the strategic aims of the animal collection to add value to the types of animal kept. The one-plan approach enables zoos to further collaborate and to further build links with other organisations to share the load, let's say, of conservation action, which hopefully can provide a better resource for the animal involved. It can provide more valuable for the money being spent and ultimately increase the likelihood of success. One of the ways that we can potentially predict the future is by looking at horizon scanning. Horizon scanning directs and focuses future activities. It enables evaluation of where the biggest impacts are likely when we attempt to meet future conservation challenges. Horizon scanning can be performed in a structured, standardized manner, and you can find various methods for performing this in the literature, and therefore it is another repeatable and valid part of the scientific method. Zoos and conservation organisations are increasingly using horizon scanning to identify burgeoning problems that might become bigger challenges in the future, and therefore when they are writing strategic aims or 5-year plans, they know where they are more likely to invest their time, money and resources to achieve more from that investment. Let's look at this in a bit more detail. Horizon scanning is quite simply a technique for detecting early signs of potentially important developments, and this is done by a systematic examination of potential threats and opportunities. It emphasizes new technology, and it emphasizes the effects of this new technology on the issue at hand. How can new technology enable better clarity, better mitigation, better alleviation of any particular problem? Horizon scanning determines what is constant, it determines what changes, and it determines what constantly changes. For example, what threats are likely to persist in the same way, what threats are likely to suddenly appear, and what threats are likely to fluctuate over time. Many stochastic events that affect populations of conservation concern can be classified in this manner. And finally, horizon scanning looks at novel and unexpected issues as well as persistent problems and trends. Therefore, we look at matters at the margins of current thinking, and this is really important because it's about attempting to look at things that we currently know which might become even bigger and more problematic in the future. We need to challenge any past assumptions and therefore find new ways of doing things. We need to analyse and consider the information we have at hand to see what that tells us about where that particular issue is likely to go in the future. A nice example I have on the slide here is the Panama golden frog, a brilliant example of how zoos and conservation organisations work together as part of a horizon scanning across the amphibian conservation crisis, and the removal of all individuals of this species into captive facilities to facilitate conservation breeding programs. That required a lot of information that we currently knew to be applied to a future that we did not know, and therefore that's allowed us to build more capacity into our ways of predicting where conservation action is needed by looking at these past models and by looking at what is working. Science should always be cumulative. Any research that you do, any application of the scientific method is based on precedent. Imagine precedent is this huge vat of information that we have. You have narrowed down the information from that vat, the bits that you have scooped out into your own project. But when you have published your project, you are adding back into that huge pool of information. so that others are then taking your work and driving it forwards. To be ethical as a scientist, we are always cumulative. We are always adding to the information that we ourselves used to help others into the future. Horizon scans are one of the most helpful things that we can do to drive forward the likelihood of conservation success. When it comes to remote technology and the way in which we can use such technology to enhance research, which is useful to the one plan approach, we could use, for example, web-based solutions, live streaming webcams, remotely accessible footage of animals within their range states, which enables us to look into their daily lives, see their activity patterns, and further understand their behavioural ecology. For many species that we house in the zoo, simple ethological study on what animals do, where they do it, and how they do it is really important to understanding captive care, husbandry needs, and anything that underpins the likelihood that we are to develop a sustainable zoo-housed population. This video footage here of the browsing impala and of the foraging vervet monkey provides a useful insight into how these animals are interacting with their environment. It shows us the resources that are relevant to them. It shows us the social groupings that they like to be in, and consequently measurement of such time activity patterns can be directly translated into breeding program or stud book management, housing and husbandry regimes of individuals in the zoo that will promote viability, both for those species and related species. A big part of my research has focused on welfare assessment of water birds in captivity, ducks, geese, swans, flamingos. And therefore, if we use these web-based solutions for understanding what animals do, we not only get a picture of their natural habitats, which then tells us what we can replicate in captivity, we can also see how they like to spend their time and how temporal effects on behaviour are important to daily time activity patterns. All of this information can further be fed into our understanding of what species need when we keep them in human care to ensure that the husbandry regimes that we provide are relevant to the species themselves. This remote camera, for example, that looks at cranes, pelicans, ducks, geese and swans and other wetland species on a major North American flyway provides valuable information on all of the activity patterns of these birds, as well as on the interactions that occur between species. Such remote monitoring using webcams and live streaming from the field allows us to capture unusual or hard to investigate behaviours, such as this incubation by a stilt on its nest. A few years back I published a paper on the nocturnal activity of flamingos. That was recorded using trail cameras around their enclosure. One of the difficulties that I had was evaluating the naturalness of those birds' behaviour patterns based on wild data. The more we can use such technology to understand animal behaviour across a 24-hour cycle, the more we can implement such important information into captive care. Animals do not go to sleep when their keepers go home. If we are to maintain fully functioning, viable populations in captivity, and by fully functioning, I mean they're fulfilling all key aspects of their life history strategy, we should use information that has been collected across both night and day, across the full 24-hour cycle, to ensure that our husbandry and population management schemes are suitable for all aspects of an individual's daily and nocturnal time activity pattern. There may be important behaviours that occur at night which are essential to breeding, which we may not understand or we may not know about. So such information from the field is really useful to the implementation of relevant conservation action if we are to know more about what species need in managed programs. Such remote access to animal behaviour, i.e. the studying of animals using live streaming, has directly informed conservation action. A paper published by myself and my colleague Dr. Kevin Wood in 2020 showed that studying the aggressive behaviour of migratory swans was really useful for for determining resource and habitat use at their wintering grounds. These migratory swans can be persecuted along their flyway. If we understand what is a valued resource, if we understand why birds gather together, and if we understand differences in aggressive behaviour and why aggression occurs, we can design habitat for them, we can augment wetland habitats to promote positive behaviours, and we can educate and explain their behaviours to local people along the flyway that may have a perceived conflict with the wildlife. Such remote monitoring is really useful to conservation planning, both at a grassroots and a wider level, because it allows us to see a snapshot of what that species is doing in various aspects of its range at various times of the year in a way that is probably more accessible than actual in-person observation. If you would like to know more about the application of horizon scanning to the zoo, then I recommend this paper by Marcus Gusset and colleagues that is available in Zoo Biology. It's a few years old now, but it still provides useful details on what can be scanned for. And this paper suggested that the 10 most important emerging issues with potential to impact upon threatened species conservation from a zoo and aquarium perspective are diseases, well, isn't that hilarious? Zoonoses and biosecurity issues, how very apt for the world we are currently living in. New communication technologies and how information is shared. Global water shortages and food insecurity. Remember, conservation is all about people. We must get people to care and buy into our conservation actions. Developing economies and markets for wildlife consumption, which links beautifully to the top point and again is very relevant to the current pandemic we are living through. Changes in wildlife population dynamics, need for extractive reserves, space shortages in zoos and aquariums, metapopulation management met beautifully by the one plan approach, political instability and conflict, and demand for caring of more species in zoos and aquaria. See my Panama golden frog example. So, a list of things that are likely to be challenges that we need to meet, and science and the research output from science is one of the ways that we can meet these challenges. And my explanation to you of the one plan approach, of the linking of the zoo and the field, is a way of providing information to this horizon scan that can meet a future conservation challenge. What is that challenge? It's capacity building. It's the need to know how to conserve, when to conserve, and what to invest in these conservation efforts. I've attempted to break down how horizon scanning can be directly useful to the one plan approach. So how does horizon scanning help build, design and implement successful one plan approaches to conservation? We can consider what the current threats to population sustainability are in that species, and therefore we can use that based on our sliding scale of management. Do we put more effort into conservation of that population out in the field by removing threats that we know we can successfully remove? Or do we put more effort into our captive animals and ensure that the ARC paradigm, i.e. the way that we manage these populations so they're safe and secure in captivity, will allow them to be sustainable into the future? We can identify persistent threats in the wild, as well as the likelihood that we can mitigate these threats through our conservation action. It's no good in putting a species back into the wild if the threat is still there, because the population will again tend towards extinction. We can identify knowledge gaps and training needs. This is essential if effective conservation action is to be implemented. We must build capacity in the people that are involved in conservation action. Without that capacity building, without that educational, without that access to resources that allows that education to be built, we're not going to be successful in our conservation roles. Do we have a strategy for metapopulation management? As I've illustrated with the giraffe, can we bring people together to publish our ideas on how the zoo giraffe and the wild giraffe can work together to meet the same goal? And therefore, if we do need to bring people together to strategize on metapopulation management, what barriers can we overcome? What discussion or collaboration issues are there that are preventing people from talking? Conservation is awash with politics. we must remove that politics. We must remember that collaboration is much better than competition, because ultimately we're all after the same aim. Successful conservation action should keep that species viable well into the future. If you'd like to know more about how One Plan and how horizon scanning can be implemented into the conservation outputs of the zoo, I recommend this paper by Traylor Holzer and colleagues from Zoo Biology, published in 2019. It's all about integrated collection assessment and planning, bringing people together in workshops to build this capacity. It allows zoos to move towards a one-plan approach at a species-specific level. In this case, it was involving the IUCN Hyaenid and Canid tag. So wild dogs and hyenas, the role that those animals in the zoo play to their wild world counterparts. And what I have just done on this slide is copied one of their figures that's all about the maned wolf, one of the species of conservation concern that was the focus of this workshop. What's the role of the maned wolf in the zoo at the moment? What objectives and outputs can we get by keeping maned wolf in captivity? What are the issues and threats faced by this species in the wild? What conservation action is required? And how can we promote such conservation action by using our captive maned wolves? So the idea that we can consider adding value to the animals in our collections by understanding their direct links to wild world conservation is one of the key aspects of the One Plan approach. We can really show how planning with experts from across the board, those that understand the animal in the zoo and those that understand the animal in the field, is really, really useful for explaining why this species is kept, how this species is managed, and what the long-term strategy of management for this species is. Please do go and have a look at this example, as well as the other examples in the paper, because it's a really nice way of strategizing into the future, of attempting to inform conservation policy and practice based on evidence, and embedding this One Plan approach into global zoo population collection planning. I said earlier that zoos are pushed for space, resources and money when it comes to prioritizing what they keep and how they keep it. And I think these data show this really nicely. I appreciate that this is an older paper now, but Dalia Conda and her colleagues published this assessment of a meta-population approach to support conservation breeding in 2013, and they include these figures. Again, this shows the number of species housed in ISIS zoos, ISIS being the old name for species 360, which dates the paper. But it's still an interesting picture on how zoos divide up their animal collections. For some taxonomic groups, such as reptiles, a large proportion of those species housed in species 360 zoos are threatened. They are of conservation concern. But the most speciose group housed, the birds, 2,300 species, only 8% of those species housed are threatened. Therefore, to fully engage with the One Plan approach and to fully integrate conservation planning with a range of experts, with a range of species that require that action, zoos need to change and consider the role of their bird collections and the species they are keeping. And to link to that, there was a paper in Zoo Biology by Bager and colleagues, again published in 2019, that provided information on how to guide the prioritization of the most endangered and evolutionary distinct birds for new zoo conservation programs. And they looked at measures of evolutionary distinctness as one of the ways of prioritizing the types of bird species kept, i.e., how distinct is that species from an evolutionary perspective? What are the key adaptive traits that it has? What other relatives does it have that are still living? How unique is it in the features that it possesses? So what is it telling us about all of those wonderful evolutionary processes? How threatened is it with extinction? And if it is threatened with extinction, how likely is it that if it does go extinct, we will lose all of that amazing genetic potential, all of that evolutionary distinctiveness that is wrapped up within that one species? So zoos are building on this work. They are building on these data as presented by Dalia Conda and her colleagues to move their captive collections forward, to increase the number of threatened species housed, and to therefore fully engage with the one plan approach. Collaboration between zoos and other organisations that results in successful conservation efforts is not new, and one plan is not there to replace these existing links. One plan aims to augment such relationships, to increase the buy-in from all stakeholders, and to share knowledge and access to resources that are vital to successful species conservation action. These are trumpeter swans, a wild pair with their cygnets that live at the Toronto Zoo. The trumpeter swan is probably one of the most successful conservation stories from the 20th century. From a population crash down to 70 individuals in the 1930s, by 2010, the population across all of its range in North America had reached 46,000 birds. And this was thanks to the hard work of the US Fish and Wildlife Service, the Trumpeter Swan Society, and many AZA zoos working together to ensure that the captive population was providing youngsters for the reintroduction efforts, and that the reintroduced birds were monitored and cared for with the expertise and skills of all of those wild scientists and zookeepers that had been involved in the project. Wild swans that now breed at the Toronto Zoo is no thanks to this zoo's efforts in maintaining and encouraging this wild species within the habitats that the zoo maintains, and because of the links the zoo has with other organisations that are invested in this bird's future. The successful breeding and reintroduction of the trumpeter swan shows how important an understanding of species ecology and behavioural ecology to conservation is. Zoos need to consider the behaviours of the species and of the individuals that they keep. They need to have a zero-tolerance approach to abnormal repetitive behaviour, and therefore they need to create environments for their animals that are behaviourally stimulating and enhance the performance of behaviours that have a fitness benefit. We need to see less of the route tracing or abnormal stereotypic activities, as is demonstrated by this elephant, and more of the behavioural complexity that such highly cognitive species are evolved to perform. Without the performance of naturalistic behaviours in captivity, individuals that are born in captivity will possess fewer of the survival skills that the founders of this population had that are essential to long-term population success in the wild state. And zoos should also consider the relevance of the species that they are keeping. Yes, some individuals might be crowd pleasers, and yes, they might bring in more visitors, which equates to more funding, but they are also taking up space, and they eat into these valuable resources that zoos need for conservation. So we must refine collection plans. We must consider the ethics of the collection plan and the reason why individuals are being kept. It would be much better to have a zoo enclosure that told the story of Sumatran tiger conservation and the links between local people and the tigers that live on their doorstep, which has real conservation relevance, rather than showcase an unusual white tiger, which might be a crowd pleaser but has no real conservation relevance. As conservation moves forward, we should consider embracing novel technologies more and more, for example, reproductive technologies, to harness their usefulness for ensuring that species can persist into the future. On my trip to San Diego in 2014, not only was I lucky enough to see the California Condor Project, but I was also lucky enough to see a northern white rhino in person. The San Diego Zoo at the time housed 2 of them, and sadly they both died a few months later. The northern white rhino, at least some of its genes, might be saved by novel reproductive technologies and the use of the southern white rhino as a surrogate, but we are still going to lose a subspecies when the last 2 female animals that are out in Africa eventually die. It's important to think about these messages from the past and how conservation action requires planning, it requires collaboration, and it requires more people working together to ensure that we don't lose any more facets of biodiversity. Hence my example with the giraffe, a species with a large global captive population that is still viable, and therefore we have the chance, the tools and the knowledge at our disposal to actually implement successful conservation for some of these endangered giraffe subspecies. So we should do our horizon scan that looks at threats and opportunities, that looks at the usefulness of technology and how it can be applied to species. And we should continue to build bridges between those that work with the animal in the zoo, as well as those that work with the animal in the field. The reason that I went to San Diego in 2014 was to attend the International Flamingo Symposium that was hosted out there by SeaWorld San Diego. And one of the talks that was given, when one plan was still something that was brand new from the Species Survival Commission, was the way in which we could build a one plan approach for flamingos. And this was a speech given by a colleague of mine from the Wildfowl and Wetlands Trust. And one of his slides I have summarised here. What do zoos need from field experts? What does the zoo community need from the wild to further advance its conservation planning and ultimately do a one plan approach for the 6 species of flamingo? Guidance on priority species for collection planning is really useful. Why are we keeping that species in those particular zoos? Can we get more participation in tags or SSP meetings of experts from the field and from the zoo to bring all of that knowledge together? Can we have zoo staff involvement in field-based conservation, bringing their practical knowledge out into the wild? We can use current information for exhibition and educational displays that have been sent to the zoo from those field scientists working out with the animals in its range state. We can provide advice on which in situ projects to support by using evidence from field scientists. And with increasing use of media and science communication, further collaboration across many interested parties and the fundraising potential that that brings is possible. But ultimately, increasing the profile of the zoo in field-based conservation and management, for example, habitat recovery works, is possible with more dialogue between those in the field with those in the zoo, and that bringing together of expertise that is all about those particular species that people are interested in. And I love the title of this slide. One plan, one community. Everybody is working together for these species to meet the same ultimate objective. So we can think about taking zoo science to the next level when we know about the collaborative potential, when we know about the relationships that we can build, and when we know about all of that expertise that's available to help us with conservation action. We can use big data, data sets that contain loads of data points that span institutions, facilities, species or programs, and we can ask lots of questions of those big data that are relevant to a range of situations. We can get a wider readership if our science is more interesting to a wider number of people. Science that's just conducted in one zoo on one population is a case study that is important but has a narrow readership of those directly related to the output of that science. Science that takes that case study and expands upon it to add in more data points, more populations, and more challenges increases its audience and therefore is going to have a wider readership with more ultimate impact. And if we have more impact, if we have more data points, which makes our statistical analysis more valid, which means it's relevant to more in the scientific and non-scientific community, we can eventually change policy. It's important that we always use information that guides conservation work, to explain that to central government, to explain that to policymakers, so that they can make decisions based on evidence, which is ultimately for the benefit of the human and the non-human animal. So I would urge you, as the future zoo scientist of this country and globally, think about impact. How can you increase the impact of your work? How can you do more with your data? How can you advance your readership and encourage more and more people to engage with your research output? Because ultimately, the more impact you have, the more clout you will have, the more research money you will get, and the more people will listen to you. If you'd like to know more about any of these examples that link to horizon scanning, then I recommend these papers to you. William Sutherland from the University of Cambridge has published extensively on global conservation issues, and he's done a wide-ranging and long-running horizon scan for particular topics. And these papers are published in the journal Trends in Ecology and Evolution. There's the 2018 horizon scan of emerging issues for global conservation and biological diversity. And there is a slightly earlier paper from 2009, which talks about the need for an environmental horizon scan, which ultimately was the catalyst for these other more recent update papers that further refine the questions that we can ask where we are trying to predict the future, where we are trying to use that information to understand future challenges. And again, if science is cumulative, there's all our precedent, here's what we're doing, and that's how we push it forward. We must keep thinking about what's likely to come next, about how we use the information we currently have, and about how we build in more capacity to meet any of these challenges with what we currently know alongside of what we potentially don't know about the future. Of course, the problem with that is that we don't know anything about the future. So we are looking at prediction and as making our predictions as accurate as possible based on the information that we have, based on the modelling that we can do, and based on the information to hand. We also need to remember that we can base information for the future on precedent. What's gone before? What can we learn from it? I hope this short presentation has explained to you the importance of the one plan approach to modern day and future conservation-based solutions. Integration of information between all stakeholders, collaboration and exchange of knowledge, planning for the usefulness of zoo individuals to the wild, and using information from the wild to help out the zoo. Horizon scans allow us to understand likely challenges that we need to meet, things that remain constant, things that are changing, and things that constantly change. By looking broadly across a range of areas related to the particular issue we are interested in, we can better highlight ideas that might be eventual solutions or that might allow us to mitigate, change, or ameliorate threats in a way that enables species to persist and be successful many, many years into the future. Thank you.